They said he ran away with the company money, but that was a lie. He never left that night, I know, because I helped cover it up.
The morning rain beat heavily against the tall windows of the courthouse, casting long, gray shadows across the mahogany desk in my chambers. I sat there in the quiet isolation that precedes the storm of the daily docket, running my hand over the thick fabric of my black robe. After presiding over this court for decades, I've learned that every folder stacked before me isn't just a collection of police reports and legal jargon. It is a living, breathing human tragedy waiting to be unpacked. People often believe that the law is a rigid, unfeeling machine, a binary system of guilty or not guilty. But as a judge, my real job has always been to read the spaces between the lines, to listen to the heavy silence that follows a broken plea. I took a deep breath, gathered my files, and pushed open the heavy oak door leading to the bench. The courtroom was packed, as it always is, on a Tuesday morning. There is a distinct, suffocating hum in a room full of people bracing themselves for judgment, a blend of frantic whispers, shuffling feet, and the unspoken fear of the unknown. I took my seat, adjusting my glasses as I surveyed the gallery. Some faces were hardened by a lifetime of bad choices, others pale with the shock of their first mistake. Call the first case, I instructed my bailiff. Docket number 402B, the state versus Arthur Hayes. The bailiff's voice rang out, cutting through the low murmur of the crowd. A man slowly detached himself from the back row and began the long walk toward the defendant's podium. Arthur Hayes was a man who looked as though the world had chewed him up and spit him out several times over. He was in his early 60s, but his posture, stooped and defeated, made him look much older. His clothes were neat but threadbare, hanging loosely off a frame that had clearly lost too much weight. But it wasn't his ragged appearance that caught my attention. It was his eyes. They were completely devoid of the usual panic, excuse-making, or defiance I see every single day. Instead, they held a haunting, hollow resignation, like a man who had already sentenced himself long before he ever stepped into my courtroom. I opened his file. The charge was seemingly straightforward: criminal trespassing on private property, specifically the old, abandoned Blackwood textile mill on the edge of town. A minor misdemeanor. Normally, a case like this would end with a small fine, perhaps some community service, or a stern warning from the bench. But as I looked down at Arthur, whose trembling hands gripped the edges of the wooden podium until his knuckles turned white, my instincts flared. The trespassing charge was just a shadow. There was a much darker, heavier truth anchored to this man, a ghost he had dragged into my court. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," I said, keeping my tone measured and calm, trying to bridge the vast, intimidating gap between the high bench and his podium. "I see you're here for a trespassing charge at the old mill. The police report states you've been found there 3 times this month. Can you tell me what you were doing there in the middle of the night?" Arthur didn't look at me right away. He stared down at his scuffed boots, his jaw trembling violently. He took a shallow, ragged breath, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, cracking under a weight I couldn't yet comprehend. "I wasn't trespassing, Your Honor," Arthur murmured, his hollow eyes finally lifting to meet mine, filled with a decade of unspoken agony. "I was just visiting the grave." The word grave hung in the air, heavy and sharp, instantly silencing the restless murmur of the gallery behind him. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly in the sudden, suffocating quiet of the courtroom. My eyes locked onto Arthur Hayes. I have heard every excuse in the book for trespassing, scavenging for copper wire, seeking shelter from the bitter cold, or simply teenagers looking for a thrill. But a grave? The old Blackwood textile mill was an industrial ruin, a decaying monolith of brick and rusted steel that had been shuttered and boarded up tightly for exactly 10 years. There were no cemeteries anywhere near that contaminated soil. "Mr. Hayes," I said, my voice dropping to a softer, more careful register. I didn't want to break the fragile thread holding this man together. The Blackwood Mill is an abandoned factory site. It has been closed since the company went bankrupt a decade ago. There are no registered burial grounds on that property. Whose grave are you visiting? Arthur's hands trembled so violently that the cuffs of his faded flannel shirt shook. He looked around the courtroom like a trapped animal, his hollow eyes darting toward the prosecution's table, then up to the heavy wooden seal of justice hanging above my head. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. When he spoke again, the sheer agony in his voice made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "It's not registered, Your Honor," he rasped, his voice cracking, thick with unshed tears. "Because nobody knows he's there. Nobody but me. And the men who put him in the ground." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor, a sharp young attorney named Miss Vance, immediately stood up, her brow furrowed in confusion and sudden alarm. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a simple trespassing arraignment. The defendant is rambling and making baseless." "Overruled, Miss Vance," I interrupted sharply, raising a hand to silence her. My gaze never left Arthur's broken figure. In my decades on the bench, I have developed a visceral sense for when a man is lying to save his own skin, and when a man is bleeding out a truth that has been poisoning him from the inside. Arthur was bleeding. The weight he had been carrying for a decade was finally crushing him. "Arthur," I said gently, removing my glasses and leaning forward over the massive wooden bench, stripping away the distance between us. "Take a deep breath. Look at me. Who is buried under the Blackwood mill?" Arthur gripped the podium, his knuckles turning a stark, bone white. He squeezed his eyes shut, and finally, the dam broke. A single, agonizing sob tore from his chest, shattering the quiet of the room. "Marcus," he wept, his voice echoing off the high, paneled walls. "Marcus Davis, the boy they said ran away with the company money 10 years ago. He didn't run, Judge Boyd. He never left that night. I know, because I helped them pour the concrete." The sharp crack of my wooden gavel slammed against the sounding block 3 times, the sheer force of it slicing through the sudden eruption of chaos in the courtroom. "Order! I will have order in this court immediately." My voice boomed, carrying the heavy, uncompromising weight of decades spent on the bench. The gallery fell into a stunned, breathless silence, but the air remained thick, practically vibrating with tension. To my right, the young prosecutor, Miss Vance, stood frozen, the case file trembling visibly in her hands. Arthur Hayes's confession was no longer just a statement on the record. It was a live grenade that had just been unpinned right in the middle of my courtroom. Marcus Davis. The name unlocked a distant, ugly memory, a dark stain on the judicial history of this city. 10 years ago, the case of the young, ambitious accountant accused of embezzling millions from the Blackwood textile mill had dominated the headlines. The media had painted a vivid picture of a greedy opportunist who had fled the country, living a life of luxury built on the sweat and tears of hardworking mill employees. Not a single person, not even the most seasoned investigators in the district, had ever imagined a scenario as dark and ruthless as the one the broken man standing before me had just described. "Mr. Hayes," I said, leaning far over the massive oak bench, clasping my hands tightly together, my eyes locked onto his sunken, bloodshot gaze, refusing to let him look away. "Do you fully comprehend the gravity of what you are saying on the record right now? You are implicating yourself in the concealment of a homicide over the course of a decade. Why? Why would you carry a secret that horrific for 10 years, only to stand here today and tear it open with your own 2 hands?" Arthur slumped against the wooden podium, his bony shoulders heaving with wave after wave of physical agony. "Because I can't take another day of it, Your Honor," he wheezed, his voice sounding like it was being torn raw from his chest. 10 years, 3,650 nights. I haven't closed my eyes a single time without hearing that boy screaming under the cold concrete. They told me to just mix the cement, pour it thick, take the cash, and forget it ever happened. They spread the rumor that Marcus was a thief, a coward who deserved whatever he got. But when I looked into that kid's eyes, right before the dirt went over him, I knew he was innocent. He didn't steal anything. He just found the real ledger. I felt a sudden, icy chill trace its way down my spine, a terrible premonition of institutional rot threatening to burst wide open. "Who are they, Arthur? Who gave the order to pour that concrete and bury Marcus Davis?" The entire courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. It was so quiet, I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. Arthur slowly raised his head. The mask of quiet resignation had completely shattered, revealing a state of pure, primal terror. He glanced nervously over his shoulder at the gallery, swallowed hard, and fixed his eyes on the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room. They are men you do not want to cross. Judge Boyd. Arthur trembled, his knuckles white as bone. Men wearing the most expensive suits, sitting in the highest seats of power in this very city. And if I say their names out loud in this room, I swear to you, I will not live to see the sun rise tomorrow. The silence that followed Arthur's words was not empty. It was suffocating, thick with the invisible weight of corruption that had just been dragged into the harsh fluorescent light of my courtroom. I looked past the trembling man at the podium and scanned the crowded gallery. Suddenly, the faces of the public didn't just look like curious onlookers or citizens waiting patiently for their traffic hearings. I found myself wondering who among them was a watcher, who in this room was already drafting a text message to a burner phone in a corporate high-rise downtown. The law is a powerful shield, but I knew better than anyone that a shield is entirely useless if the person holding it is stabbed in the back by the very system they serve. I picked up my gavel, but I didn't strike the block. Instead, I pointed the wooden handle at my bailiff, a burly, decorated military veteran named Miller, who had been with me for 15 years. "Miller," I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding timbre that carried to every shadowed corner of the room. "Lock the doors. Call the federal marshals. Nobody enters, and absolutely nobody leaves this courtroom until I say otherwise." The heavy, metallic clack of the deadbolts echoing through the chamber sent a visible, physical jolt through the crowd, but I didn't give them time to panic. I turned my absolute focus back to the broken man clutching the wooden podium. "Mr. Hayes," I said, leaning forward until I was speaking directly to him, ignoring the frantic whispers of the gallery. "As long as you stand in my courtroom, you are under the full, uncompromising protection of this bench. But let's be perfectly clear. A confession of this magnitude without hard physical evidence is nothing but a death sentence disguised as a ghost story. You mentioned a ledger earlier. You said Marcus Davis found the real financial ledger before they killed him." Arthur swallowed hard, his sunken eyes darting frantically to the locked oak doors before returning to mine. "They tore the entire mill apart looking for it, Judge. They brought in private security. They burned his apartment down to the concrete foundation and told the papers it was a tragic gas leak. They thought it was destroyed." "Is it destroyed, Arthur?" I pressed, keeping my gaze steady, trying to anchor him to the safety of this room. He shook his head, a slow, agonizing movement. "No, Your Honor." Marcus was a terrified kid, but he was brilliant. He knew they were coming for him. When they forced him into the dirt that night, he didn't have it on him. But I found it. 3 days later, I went back to the mill in the dead of night because the guilt was tearing my mind in half. I found it wrapped in heavy industrial plastic, taped high up inside the rusted exhaust pipe of the main boiler room. "Where is that ledger right now?" I asked, my heart pounding a heavy rhythm against my ribs. Arthur gripped the podium so hard I thought the wood might splinter. "It's hidden, but I can't give it to the local police, Judge. You know I can't. If I hand that book to a uniform in this city, it will vanish from the evidence locker before sunset, and I will be found hanging in a holding cell by midnight." The heavy truth of Arthur's words hung in the air, chilling the very marrow in my bones. He wasn't acting out of paranoia. He was stating a cold, terrifying logistical fact. In a city where old textile money had bought and sold politicians, judges, and police chiefs for generations, the local precinct was incredibly porous. If a piece of evidence that explosive went into the standard lockup, it would be incinerated by morning, and Arthur Hayes would become nothing more than a tragic, unexplained suicide in a holding cell. I looked down at the trembling man, deeply aware that by speaking these words aloud, he had just painted a massive, glowing target on his own back. "You are absolutely right, Arthur," I said, my voice remarkably steady, cutting through the thick, suffocating tension of the locked room. "Local law enforcement will not touch this. Not the ledger, and certainly not you." I turned my attention to my bailiff, Miller, who was standing guard by the heavy oak doors, his hand resting instinctively near his sidearm. "Miller, you said the federal marshals were already in the building?" "Yes, Your Honor. Deputy Marshal Vance and his team are in the outer hallway right now," Miller replied, his voice a low, disciplined rumble. "They're waiting for your word to either breach or secure the perimeter." "Tell them to secure the perimeter." No one leaves this gallery, and no cell phones are to be used. Confiscate any devices if you have to, I ordered. Then, I did something I had never done in my entire career. I pulled my personal cell phone from beneath my black robes, a strict violation of standard courtroom protocol. But we were miles past standard procedure now. We were standing on the edge of a systemic collapse. I dialed a direct number I hadn't called in over 5 years. The phone rang twice before a gruff, alert voice answered. Agent Harris, I said, keeping my eyes fixed intensely on the gallery, watching for anyone making sudden movements or shifting uncomfortably in their seats. It's Judge Frank Boyd. I have a critical situation in courtroom 3B. I need a federal evidence retrieval team dispatched immediately to the old Blackwood Mill main boiler room. Inside the rusted exhaust pipe, taped high up in heavy industrial plastic, there is a financial ledger. There was a sharp, calculating pause on the other end of the line. Harris was a veteran FBI agent, a man who didn't ask unnecessary questions when a sitting judge's tone turned to absolute steel. What are we looking at, Frank? He asked quietly. A 10-year-old homicide and a corporate conspiracy that is going to tear the roof off this entire city, I replied, making sure my voice carried enough weight to be recorded by the court stenographer, who was typing furiously, her hands shaking. Do not involve local PD under any circumstances. Go straight to the site. Call me the exact second that ledger is in your hands. I hung up the phone and looked back down at Arthur. The massive surge of adrenaline that had propelled him to the podium, that had forced this terrifying confession out of his lungs, was rapidly draining from his fragile, malnourished frame. His knees began to buckle, his white-knuckled grip slipping painfully from the edge of the wooden stand. He looked like a man who had finally put down a mountain, only to realize his spine was shattered. Hold on, mister. Hayes, I urged, standing up from my high-backed leather chair and stepping down from the bench to bridge the distance between us. You've carried this nightmare in the dark for 10 long years. Just hold on a little longer. The light is coming. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B remained dead-bolted. Time, which usually dictated the rigid, unforgiving schedule of my daily docket, seemed to have completely stopped. The gallery was trapped in a suffocating limbo, a suspended animation where every ticking second felt like a physical weight pressing down on our chests. I sat high on the bench, my eyes constantly scanning the room, watching the subtle shifts in body language. A few people in the back rows were whispering furiously, their eyes darting nervously toward the locked exits. The young prosecutor, Miss Vance, had slowly lowered herself into her chair, her meticulously organized files now seemingly irrelevant. She was a sharp, ambitious lawyer, but she had walked into this room expecting a routine trespassing plea. Now, she was staring at Arthur Hayes, as if she were looking at a ghost. I could see the exact moment it clicked in her eyes. She finally understood that the justice system she had sworn to uphold was actively bleeding out on the floor in front of her. Arthur had collapsed into the heavy wooden chair at the defense table. He was trembling so violently that the table vibrated against the floorboards. He had his face buried in his calloused, dirt-stained hands, muttering a silent, desperate prayer. He had taken the ultimate gamble. He had bet his life that the federal agents would reach that rusted exhaust pipe in the Blackwood Mill before the city's invisible power brokers realized what he had confessed. If Agent Harris didn't find that ledger, if the mill had already been swept by private security, or if the corrupt officials had intercepted the information, Arthur wouldn't just go to prison. He would simply cease to exist, erased by the exact same men who had poured the concrete over young Marcus Davis 10 years ago. Breathe, Arthur, I said softly, my microphone picking up the quiet command and echoing it through the tense chamber. We hold the line right here. Whatever happens outside those doors, you are not carrying this alone anymore. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and brimming with a fragile, terrified hope. But before he could speak, the sharp, piercing ring of my personal cell phone shattered the silence. Every single person in the courtroom flinched. The sound was deafening in the absolute quiet. I picked up the phone from the bench. My hand, which had signed thousands of warrants and sentencing orders over the decades without a single tremor, felt suddenly heavy. I pressed the answer button and brought the receiver to my ear, keeping my expression entirely unreadable to the watchers in the gallery. Harris, I said, my voice low and steady. There was a moment of heavy static, the sound of harsh wind and distant sirens echoing through the receiver. Then, the veteran FBI agent's voice cut through the noise, tight with adrenaline and absolute disbelief. You were right, Frank. Harris breathed heavily over the line. We breached the main boiler room, taped high up inside the exhaust pipe, wrapped in industrial plastic. Exactly like your guy said, we have the ledger. Harris paused, and I could hear the rustling of thick, aged paper. Frank, I've only glanced at the first 3 pages, but the names on these transaction logs, my God. It's not just the textile executives. You've got city councilmen, 2 police captains, and a state senator in here. This isn't just an embezzlement cover-up. It's a localized syndicate. This book is going to bring down half the city. We are locking down the site as a federal crime scene and calling in the tactical units right now. I let out a slow, measured breath, feeling the crushing weight of a 10-year lie finally begin to fracture. I lowered the phone slowly, the heavy plastic of the receiver feeling as cold as ice against my palm. The sheer magnitude of what Agent Harris had just confirmed was almost too massive to fully process in a single heartbeat. A state senator, city councilman, 2 police captains. This was no longer just a murder cover-up. It was the unearthing of a systemic rot that had been deeply woven into the very fabric of our local government. The men who had ordered Marcus Davis to be buried in wet concrete weren't just criminals operating in the shadows. They were the architects of the city's laws, the very people who funded the police departments and appointed the judges. They had built an entire empire on a graveyard of lies. And Arthur Hayes, a broken, terrified laborer, had just handed me the sledgehammer to bring it all crashing down. I placed the phone back beneath my robes and looked down at Arthur. He was still trembling, his hands clamped over his face, waiting for the verdict that would either save his soul or end his life. The courtroom remained frozen in a state of suspended terror, every pair of eyes locked onto the bench, waiting for me to translate the silent phone call. Arthur, I said, my voice softer now, but carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the heavy mahogany panels of the room. Look at me. He slowly lowered his hands. His face was a map of pure, unadulterated fear, his breath catching painfully in his throat. They found it, I told him, holding his gaze steadily so he could see the absolute truth in my eyes. Agent Harris has the ledger. It was exactly where you said it would be. The FBI has secured the mill, and the federal tactical units are locking down the evidence as we speak. You were right, Arthur, about all of it. They have the names. For a long, agonizing second, Arthur simply stared at me, his mind desperately trying to comprehend the words. And then, the dam finally broke. It wasn't a sigh of relief or a triumphant cheer. It was a guttural, earth-shattering wail that tore from the deepest, darkest pit of his chest. His legs gave out completely, and he collapsed to his knees, right there on the hard wooden floor of the courtroom. He wrapped his arms around himself, sobbing with a violent, unrestrained intensity. It was the sound of a man purging a decade of toxic, suffocating guilt. The ghost of young Marcus Davis, which had haunted his every waking moment for 10 years, was finally being laid to rest. The gallery erupted into a frantic wave of gasps and terrified whispers. Miss Vance, the young prosecutor, stood up on shaking legs, her face completely drained of color. She looked at the weeping man on the floor, then up at me, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. Your Honor, Judge Boyd, what? What exactly is happening here? She stammered, gripping the edge of her table, as if the ground beneath her was suddenly shifting. Who are they talking about? What names? I looked at her, seeing the stark realization dawning in her young, ambitious eyes. She was a prosecutor who believed in the absolute sanctity of the system, and I was about to show her the monsters hiding behind the curtain. What is happening, counselor, is a reckoning, I replied, my voice echoing with a cold, unforgiving authority. For 10 years, the justice system in this city has been weaponized to protect men in expensive suits while burying the innocent in the dirt. But that ends today, right here, in this room. I turned my attention back to the heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom. Miller, I called out to my bailiff, open the doors. but only for the federal marshals. Local law enforcement is strictly barred from entering this chamber. As Miller reached for the heavy brass deadbolts, the loud, authoritative pounding of heavy tactical boots echoed from the hallway outside. The cavalry had arrived, and the true trial of this city was only just beginning. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open, not with a polite creak, but with the definitive, forceful thud of absolute federal authority. Deputy Marshal Vance strode down the center aisle, flanked by 4 heavily armed tactical agents. Their presence instantly sucked the remaining air out of the room. The local gallery, previously buzzing with frantic, terrified whispers, fell completely and utterly silent. The power dynamic in the chamber shifted so violently you could practically feel the change in air pressure. The invisible empire of the city's corrupt elite was crumbling in real time. I pointed the handle of my gavel directly toward the defense table. "Deputy Vance," I called out, my voice slicing through the heavy silence. "The man sitting there is Arthur Hayes. As of this exact moment, he is no longer a defendant in my local jurisdiction. He is the primary, indispensable federal witness in a multi-agency RICO and homicide investigation. I am officially placing him under your absolute protective custody. He does not leave your sight, and he does not go anywhere near a local precinct." Vance gave a sharp, affirmative nod. "Understood, Judge Boyd. We have a secure transport waiting out back and a safe house prepped out of state. We've got him." 2 marshals stepped forward and gently helped Arthur to his feet. For the first time, they didn't treat him like a criminal. They didn't reach for their handcuffs. Instead, they flanked him like a human shield, treating him like the most valuable asset in the city. As they guided him toward the center aisle, Arthur stopped. He turned his frail, battered body back toward the high mahogany bench. He didn't say a word, but his bloodshot eyes met mine, and he offered a single, trembling nod. It was a silent, profound gesture of gratitude from a man who had finally put down a burden that had been crushing his soul for a decade. I nodded back, acknowledging the sheer, terrifying courage it took for him to break his silence. Once Arthur was safely escorted out the doors, I looked down at the original case file sitting on my desk. It was a flimsy, single-page trespassing citation, a minor misdemeanor that the corrupt establishment had hoped would simply slip through the cracks of the bureaucracy. I picked up my heavy fountain pen, drew a thick, black line through the charge, and signed my name with deliberate force. "Case number 402B is hereby dismissed with extreme prejudice," I announced, my voice echoing sharply off the paneled walls. "The state has absolutely no claim on this man." I then raised my eyes and looked directly into the gallery, locking eyes with the few individuals who were frantically clutching their cell phones, the spies and sycophants who had been sent to monitor the docket. "You can tell the men who sent you here today," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, unwavering register that commanded absolute attention. "You can tell them that the concrete has finally cracked. They built their fortunes and their political careers on the arrogant assumption that the poor, the broken, and the terrified would always stay silent. They thought a laborer like Arthur Hayes would simply fade away into the shadows out of fear, but they forgot one crucial, undeniable fact about the law." I leaned forward, making sure my words would echo in their nightmares. "True justice does not care about the astronomical price of your tailored suit, the political title on your office door, or the size of your offshore bank account. When the truth is buried alive, it does not decompose. It ferments. It builds pressure. And today, a broken man, with nothing left to lose, just blew the vault wide open." I raised my gavel and struck the sounding block one final time, the sharp crack signaling the end of an era. Court is adjourned. Hours later, the rain had finally stopped. I stood alone by the tall windows of my private chambers, looking out over the downtown skyline. The flashing red and blue lights of federal cruisers were already swarming the financial district and the state capitol building. The arrests had begun. The untouchable executives, the corrupt captains, the untouchable politicians, they were all being pulled from their ivory towers. I thought about young Marcus Davis, the brilliant accountant who had died terrified in the dark dirt of the Blackwood mill. We couldn't give him his life back, but tonight we had finally given him his voice. I took off my heavy black robe, draped it over my chair, and realized the fabric felt lighter than it had in 10 years. We had looked closer. We had listened to the silence. And the dark truth had finally seen the light of day.